Hello and welcome to another mini lecture on CS200. This time I'll talk about Chapter 9, Objects and Classes. And we will talk about, in this mini lecture, Chapters 9.1 through 9.3. So let's get started. In this chapter, we begin with a lot of definitions. For 9.1 has mostly definitions, but they set the direction for the rest of the chapter. So an object you can think about as a grouping of data. So we think of objects as nouns usually, and they represent data as well as operations that can be performed on that data. So for example, a remote control. A remote control has lots of buttons, and each of the buttons have a particular input value to the remote control. So if I push the 1, the data will change to set some value equal to 1, for example, the channel number. The operation might be press this button and it will have some effect. If I hit the source twice, perhaps it will set a Boolean value for source, or perhaps changing some of the other values like these arrow keys will have a different effect. In any case, this has multiple data variables and it has many operations which we can operate or help operate the remote control of the TV. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details that they give, but I highly suggest looking through it if you're not familiar with definitions. So for abstraction, information hiding, and encapsulation, the definitions are given here, but I think a better illustration is in PowerPoint. So an abstraction is an abstract class. So there's lots of information, for example, between mango and banana. They're both types of fruit. So they have some data and they have some methods that are very similar. For example, we can eat both a mango and we can eat a banana. They both have skin, and there are some differences. For example, the color. For mangoes, they vary widely. For bananas, less so. There's no type of fruit called fruit. So we call that an abstract class. It is one in which has many of the characteristics of different types of fruit, but there's no fruit that is called fruit. They all have different characteristics. So for example, one might be named mango, one might be named banana. So they have things in common, which we can store in the fruit abstract class. And they have things that make them unique. For example, mango might have various varieties and be grown in different parts of the world, whereas bananas are typically grown within a very small region of the world. Encapsulation, or information hiding, talks about how we can kind of encapsulate the data or contain it within a certain class. So the encapsulation has the data members, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as the methods or the description of the behaviors that we can have that particular object or what can happen in that class. They illustrate it by showing like a medicine pill. So you have variables and methods that are contained within a certain envelope or class. Moving forward, we have an abstract data type. So an abstract data type, going back to the object of the remote control, there's certain well-defined operations that the remote control can do. So for example, each of the buttons may have a specific sequence. For example, if I hit source several times, it's going to rotate through all the different sources that I have connected to the television. So each of these in combination or in isolation have a specific function. And those specific functions are defined by an abstract data type. So moving on to section 9.2, using a class. So we will see that a class is a new type that a bunch of groups and methods can form an object. And what we mean by that is a class could be any kind of object that, or a set of objects, which can give us a specific grouping of information. So for example, if you think about a restaurant has certain specifics. It might have a name, It might have an address. It might have a number, a manager. So all these variables are tied to a specific class. You can see how they're grouped together because they help define what a restaurant is. So there's public member methods. So those are the operations that a user, a class user, can perform on the object. So when we say they're public, this means that they can be called by other methods outside of the class. So if we look at this example, you have restaurant. And restaurant has a name, it has a rating, and you can see here we cannot change, well, we'll see this in a minute. If a variable is declared as private, the only way we can do any kind of operation on that variable is through a public method. So a reference variable is an instance of a class. And this is a little bit vague here, but let's see the definition of how we would define a class. So when we define a class, we say restaurant, which is an object type, fave place, so that's the name of the object that we're defining as it's a restaurant. We say new restaurant. So we set the name, we set the rating, and these are all restaurants, so these are objects. So fave place is just a type of restaurant. So we say use the new keyword, because the new keyword, what that does is it explicitly allocates an object of that type, that class type. So the object would be the fave place, the specified class type would be restaurant. Okay? So we have the access operator. Let's take a look at some of these operators. Okay? So here we have restaurant favorites, and you can see here we have fave lunch place dot set name. That dot indicates that what follows is a method on that particular object. So fave lunch place is the object, dot indicates that what's going to follow is a method. So set name is the name of the method, and central deli is the argument we pass to that particular method for taking an operation on the object fave lunch place. Okay. So here are some string public members. Some of these we have studied in CS160. So we have public, char, char at, int, index. So we see here that we declare is a public, which means that outside of whatever class was defined for that particular string object, we can do operations on it. Char indicates that we're passing a character back, so that's what's expected to be returned. Char at is the name of the method, and the parameter list is just one. It's an integer of name index. So we declare it as an index is the name, and we expect it as type integer. And think about what char at does. We're passing it, we've got a string, and we're saying that the position of that string, say position 6, is what we want to return the exact character that appears in that string. We have length, which returns the length of the string. It's declared a public, so we have access outside that particular class. Integer is what's expected to be returned, and length, and then notice it has no parameters. And last, we have concatenation operation. So public string, so what we're returning is a string, and then concat is the name of the object, string is what's being passed, and we just give it the name str in our parameter list. So next we move on to defining a class. The first two sections kind of define what we're talking about, and now we're actually looking at some of the features that objects, methods, classes, and variables can do. So we've looked so far at public fields. Let's talk about private fields. Okay, so public fields are ones in which we have access outside of the class. And in the past examples where we looked at string methods, we had those as methods that were defined as public. But what happens if the fields, or remember those class variables, are defined as private? So in this example, we have restaurant. We have two private variables. Notice they're field variables because they're defined outside of the methods, but they're inside the class. So we have one that's a string. We give it the variable name as name. And the second is an integer, and that's rating. Both of these are private. And we have a couple of methods which we have set as public because that allows, again, users or people outside the class or method or can call and change, have access to. So notice here that we also have public methods that are defined inside the class. They're public because we want to have access outside of the class. And these are the ways in which we can do operations on those private variables. If we try to access one of these private variables, see here rating, if we try to access that from another class, it's going to fail because it's marked as private. So that's what this is trying to illustrate. So class members are the fields and methods that are inside that class. So those are the ones that have access to private variables inside that class. So we want to define a method. So this is one way in which we can define a method that has all the information that we need. So in restaurant, we have two private field variables. We have three public methods that can be accessed from outside the class. So for example, if we have restaurant favorites, we can pass it variables. This is, of course, a different class. This is one in which we're trying to call and set variables inside the restaurant class, which is given here. So two different classes here. So what we're doing is we're passing Central Deli and the rating of 4, and it sets the variable inside that object, and so forth. Here's another one with runner information, which I'm going to skip and let you look at. So let's take a look at this challenge activity. Okay, well, we'll get to the next challenge activity. Let's look at basic class definition. Okay, so we have defined the missing method license num, and they give you the definition. And let's take a look and try to understand what we're doing here. In case they say they have a couple of inputs, and this is what they expect as the output for the license number. Okay, so they give us some code, but then they have some that we need to fill in. And it's a good illustration for us to take a look, but I don't like to really look here in these examples. I prefer to go to BlueJ. So here are the two classes that were given to us inside of our textbook. And here we have some code that we need to add, and I've gone ahead and added it. So basically I've created another method. It's a public method that returns nothing. And basically it changes the value. So we pass it in a custom ID, and then it sets license num, which is one of our private variables, and it's a field variable. And that's set equal to, I made it 10,000 times the custom ID, so whatever's passed in, plus the license year. So these are two private variables that are stored as field variables within dog license. And then there's a get license num, which is given to us in the text, and that just returns the value. So that's in dog license. Now if we go to call dog license, I've made some changes. What I've done is I've introduced a scanner object, and then I've also prompted the user for the year of registration and the owner's ID. So this is different than what we see in the Zybook, but this also allows us to see how it operates. Okay, and then of course what it does is it finally outputs the information by calling getLicenseNum, which is in the dog license. So this, all it does is just return the value, and of course it's going to return an int. So that's what we're going to expect to be printed out. So let's see it run. Okay, so let's go to the object, and notice I have these two objects now, and notice they have an arrow. So one thing that BlueJ does is it shows that this particular class called dog license is calling, of course, dog license. So this is the one we want to run. Let's get it running. And of course, these are the prompts I put in. The year for registration, I'm going to put 2020. And the owner's ID, I'm going to put 567. So the license is 567-2020. And this is what we expect. So it would not be possible, for example, for me just to set the values for dog license directly. So I can't just say dog1 license year equals a variable. So if I did something like, instead of this, I said dog1 license year equals user year, right? Because this is what we've got. We're reading it in here. So if I just wanted to do this instead of this, I'll comment this out, and then I try to compile it, it's going to say, I don't know what you're talking about with this license year. You just don't have access to it. So it says it has private access and dog license, which is nice about BlueJ because it gives us some information about what's going on. But it's also clear that we can't modify it directly. Inside of call dog license, where we are, we don't have the ability to make changes to this because it's a private variable. So I'm hoping that this gives some illustration of how private variables, as well as some of the early definitions of objects and classes. Hopefully this makes sense to you. Let's continue on later on with some other, another mini lecture on Chapter 9.